An airport gate is a threshold of power. There are rules, hierarchies, and unwritten codes of conduct. For a seasoned airline pilot, that gate is the door to his kingdom in the sky. He decides who boards when they board, and how the rules are applied. But on a crisp autumn morning at Chicago O'Hare, one captain's absolute authority collided with a quiet, unassuming man in a simple polo shirt. The pilot saw a nobody trying to cut the line. What he failed to see was the one man who held the power to end his entire career with a single devastating sentence. This isn't just a story about prejudice. It's a story about what happens when a petty tyrant flying a multi-million-dollar machine forgets that the sky belongs to everyone, but the rules belong to the people who write them. The air in Terminal 3 of Chicago O'Hare International Airport was a familiar cocktail of jet fuel, Cinnabon, and low-grade anxiety. It was 6:05 a.m., and the early morning sun cast long, lazy shadows across the polished linoleum floors. This was Captain Roman Kessler's favorite time of day. The calm before the storm. The quiet hum of the terminal before the great unwashed masses descended, dragging their oversized roller bags and their cacophony of complaints with them. Kessler, a man whose crisp white shirt and 4 striped epaulets seemed permanently starched with authority, stood near the window of Gate K-12. He sipped a black coffee, his gaze sweeping over the sleek fuselage of the Boeing 737-800 he was about to command. Flight 1128 to San Diego. His aircraft, his schedule, his kingdom for the next 4 hours. At 54, Roman Kessler had the kind of chiseled, granite-jawed face that looked like it was designed by a military recruitment poster artist. A former Air Force pilot with 2 decades at Transcontinental Airways, he carried himself with an air of untouchable competence. He wasn't just a pilot, he was a commander. He believed in order, in hierarchy, and in the clear, unambiguous lines of authority. And in the ecosystem of an airplane, he was at the absolute apex. His first officer, Frank Miller, approached him holding 2 printouts of the flight plan. Frank was 15 years younger, earnest, and still possessed a sense of wonder about the job that Kessler had shed decades ago. "Morning, Captain," Frank said, offering one of the printouts. "Looks like a smooth ride out. A little weather over the Rockies, but we should be able to climb right over it." Kessler took the papers without making eye contact, his eyes still fixed on the plane. "Weather isn't a little, Frank. It's a system, a predictable, manageable system. Don't talk about it like it's a moody teenager." Frank's smile tightened. "Right. A manageable system." He cleared his throat. "The ground crew seems a bit behind. Fueling just finished. Catering is still loading. Then they need to move faster," Kessler said, finally turning his gaze on his co-pilot. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, pale, cold, and unforgiving. "This flight leaves at 6:45 a.m. Not 6:46, not 6:47. The schedule is the Bible, Miller. Remember that." "Yes, sir." "Captain?" Kessler's attention was then drawn to the lead flight attendant, Susan Albright, who was in a hushed, tense conversation with the gate agent Brenda. Susan, a veteran with 25 years of service, looked flustered. Kessler strode over his presence, immediately silencing their conversation. "Problem?" he asked. It wasn't a question so much as a demand for information. "Captain?" Susan began her professional smile, looking strained. "We have a family with 2 small children, one in a car seat, who are hoping to pre-board. And a gentleman here." She gestured discreetly toward a man sitting alone. "Says he requires extra time due to a leg injury." Kessler's lip curled in a barely perceptible sneer. Pre-boarding is for premier status passengers and those with documented disabilities needing wheelchair assistance. A car seat is not a disability. A sore leg is not a disability. It's an inconvenience. Let them board with their designated group. We are not a charity." Brenda, the gate agent, looked panicked, but Captain Airline policy allows for families with small children to— "Airline policy is a guideline," Brenda Kessler cut in his voice, dropping to a low, intimidating tenor. "I am the pilot in command. My policy is the law from the moment I sign for this aircraft. We are 5 minutes behind on ground prep. We are not adding to that delay with a parade of slow-moving passengers. Is that clear?" "Crystal, Captain," Brenda squeaked, nodding quickly. Susan just bit her lip and gave a single curt nod. She knew this battle was lost before it began. Kessler's infamous rigidity was a legend among the cabin crews. He was technically brilliant, a pilot who could land a plane in a hurricane, but his people skills were non-existent. He saw passengers as cargo, and his crew as extensions of the aircraft's machinery. As Kessler turned back towards the jet bridge, satisfied that order had been restored, another man approached the gate. This man was Devlin Anderson. To the casual observer, Devlin was utterly unremarkable. He was in his late 40s, African-American, with a neat, trimmed beard, just starting to show flecks of grey. He wore simple khaki trousers, comfortable-looking loafers, and a navy blue polo shirt with no discernible logo. He carried a worn leather satchel over his shoulder. He could have been a sales manager, a professor, an IT consultant. He was anonymous, and that's precisely how he liked it. He walked past the line already forming for Group 1 and approached Brenda at the podium. "Good morning," Devlin said, his voice calm and even. "I need to get on board for a pre-flight inspection." Brenda, still rattled from her encounter with Kessler, looked at him confused. "I'm sorry, sir, but we haven't started boarding yet." "Pre-boarding is—" "I understand," Devlin interrupted gently. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a laminated identification card attached to a lanyard. It wasn't an airline ID. It was a government credential. "I'm with the FAA." Brenda's eyes went wide. She'd handled dozens of FAA inspectors over the years. They were a part of the business. She took the ID and examined it. It looked legitimate. Name Devlin Anderson. Title Aviation Safety Inspector. "Oh, of course, sir. My apologies," she said, her tone shifting instantly from dismissive to deferential. "Let me just inform the captain you're coming aboard." She picked up the intercom phone to the jet bridge. Before she could press the button, Kessler reappeared at the doorway of the jet bridge, drawn by the words FAA, like a shark to blood. He had a sixth sense for anything that might disrupt his perfect orderly departure. He saw Brenda holding the ID and looking at Devlin Anderson. He didn't wait for an explanation. He saw a black man in a polo shirt, trying to get on his plane before anyone else. His internal calculus, clouded by decades of unchallenged bias and ego, arrived at an immediate and entirely wrong conclusion. This was someone trying to pull a fast one. Kessler strode forward, physically placing himself between Devlin and the jet bridge entrance. He completely ignored Brenda and addressed Devlin directly, his voice dripping with condescension. "Can I help you?" Devlin met his gaze, unfazed. "Yes. I'm here to conduct a ramp check. I need access to the flight deck." Kessler let out a short, derisive huff of air. He didn't even glance at the credentials Brenda was still holding. "A ramp check, really, son? I've been flying for 30 years. I know what an FAA inspector looks like, and you're not it. They don't send guys dressed for a barbecue." The casual racism, the dismissal of Devlin's authority based on his clothes and his skin color, hung in the air, thick and toxic. Frank Miller, who had followed Kessler out, felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. Susan Albright, standing nearby, froze her face, a mask of disbelief. Devlin's expression didn't change. His calm was a stark contrast to Kessler's barely concealed aggression. "My attire has no bearing on my duties, Captain. I need to see your airworthiness certificate, the maintenance log, and review your flight plan and crew licenses before you close that door." "You're not seeing anything," Kessler snapped, taking a half step closer. He was using his height and his uniform to intimidate. It was a tactic that had always worked. "I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to run, but this is a secure area. We're on a tight schedule. Now I suggest you go find your real boarding group and wait your turn like everyone else before I call airport security." The threat was explicit. The humiliation was public. Several passengers in the waiting Group 1 line were now staring their phones, subtly angled to record the confrontation. Brenda tried to interject. "Captain, his ID. I don't care about his ID." Kessler boomed, his voice echoing in the gate area. "It's probably fake. This is my aircraft, my gate, my departure. And you," he pointed a rigid finger at Devlin's chest, "are not getting on it." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Kessler stood there, chest puffed out, a smug look of victory on his face. He had faced down the challenger and protected the sanctity of his kingdom. Devlin Anderson held the captain's furious gaze for a long moment. The world seemed to slow down. He could hear the hum of the ventilation, the distant announcement for another flight, the frantic thumping of Frank Miller's heart. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He let the silence stretch, forcing Kessler to stew in his own belligerent display. Then Devlin spoke. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. It was devoid of anger, full of a chilling absolute authority that Kessler's blustering could never match. He looked Captain Roman Kessler directly in the eye and said, "I am FAA Aviation Safety Inspector, Devlin Anderson, badge number 724, Delta." That was not a request. That was a direct, lawful order from a federal agent. You have just refused access to a federal inspector, which is a violation of Federal Aviation Regulation 119.67. So let's try this again. You are going to step aside and allow me access to your flight deck. Or do you want to make this a career-ending event right here, right now, in front of God and everyone? "I'm the FAA Inspector. Try again." The words, "try again," landed in the sterile air of Gate K-12 like a detonation. For a moment, Captain Kessler's brain refused to process them. His entire world, built on a foundation of his own unquestioned authority, had just been leveled by a man in a polo shirt. The smug certainty on his face evaporated, replaced by a ghastly, pale shock. His eyes, which had been narrowed in aggression, were now wide with dawning horror. He looked from Devlin's unnervingly calm face to the official-looking credential Brenda was now holding out with a trembling hand, as if it were radioactive. The photo on the ID was unmistakably the man standing before him. The gold eagle emblem of the Federal Aviation Administration seemed to mock him. "I'm the FAA Inspector." The phrase echoed in Kessler's mind, each word a hammer blow against his ego. He had just threatened, belittled, and blocked a federal agent in the performance of his duties. In front of his crew, in front of his passengers. First Officer Frank Miller looked like he'd seen a ghost. He took an involuntary step back, wanting to distance himself from the crater Kessler had just created. Susan Albright pressed her lips into a thin white line, a silent, "I told you so," etched in the tense set of her jaw. She had seen Kessler's arrogance cause problems before, but this was a Category 5 hurricane of his own making. Kessler's mind raced, cycling through denial fury, and finally a desperate, pathetic attempt at damage control. His voice, when it finally emerged, was a strangled, unrecognizable version of its former confident baritone. I apologize." He stammered the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. "There's been a misunderstanding. with security threats being what they are. You can't be too careful. He was trying to frame his gross misconduct as professional diligence. Devlin Anderson's expression remained unchanged. He was a statue carved from disappointment. There was no misunderstanding, Captain. You made an assumption based on my appearance. You were unprofessional, you were obstructive, and you were wrong. Now are you going to comply, or do I need to contact the tower and have them ground this aircraft indefinitely pending a full crew review? The threat of grounding the plane was the final nail in the coffin of Kessler's defiance. The financial and logistical nightmare that would unleash all tied directly to his name was unthinkable. No, that won't be necessary, Kessler said, his voice barely a whisper. He stepped aside, the motion, stiff and robotic like a machine whose gears had been stripped. He gestured numbly toward the jet bridge. Please, after you, Inspector. Devlin gave a single sharp nod. He walked past Kessler without another word and disappeared into the jet bridge. The quiet click of his loafers on the metal floor sounded like a countdown timer. Kessler stood frozen for a moment, the eyes of his crew and the passengers boring into him. The hero of his own story had become the villain in a matter of seconds. He shot a venomous glare at Brenda, as if it were her fault, before turning and following Devlin onto the plane, his confident stride, now a shamed shuffle. Frank Miller followed them, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The flight deck, usually a sanctuary of calm professionalism, now felt like a courtroom. Devlin was already there, his leather satchel on the observer's jump seat. He didn't sit. He stood, his presence filling the small space. Let's start with the aircraft maintenance log. Devlin said, his tone all business. Kessler, fumbling slightly, pulled the thick binder from its slot. His hands, usually so steady on the controls of a 200,000-pound aircraft, had a slight tremor. He handed it to Devlin. For the next 20 minutes, Devlin Anderson conducted the most thorough, meticulous, and agonizingly silent ramp check Kessler had ever endured. He didn't just glance at the logbook. He read every entry for the past week, his finger tracing each sign-off. He cross-referenced a deferred maintenance item, a minor issue, with a cabin reading light, with the minimum equipment list manual, quizzing Frank on the exact procedure for logging it. Frank answered correctly, his voice steady, while Kessler stood by, silent and sweating under the collar of his pristine white shirt. Devlin then asked for their pilot licenses and medical certificates. He scrutinized them under the dim cockpit light, holding them up as if searching for microscopic flaws. He looked at Kessler's. Captain Roman Kessler, expiration date is near. You'll need to get your physical done soon. It was a simple statement of fact, but it sounded like a warning. He turned to Frank. First Officer Frank Miller, clean record. Attended the voluntary CRM seminar last quarter. Good. He handed the license back to Frank with a nod of approval that felt to Kessler like a deliberate slap in the face. Crew resource management, the art of teamwork and communication in the cockpit, was a subject Kessler openly mocked as sensitivity training for pilots. Finally, Devlin looked at the flight plan. You're aware of the developing convective system over eastern Colorado. Of course, Kessler said, trying to reclaim some semblance of his authority. I've already planned a route 20 miles to the south to avoid the worst of it. The NWS update from 10 minutes ago shows the system moving southeast faster than projected, Devlin said, pointing to a notation he'd apparently seen on his phone before boarding. Your planned route might clip the edge of it. There's a PIREP from a cargo flight an hour ahead of you reporting moderate chop at flight level 350. You might want to consider requesting 370 from center once you're over Nebraska. It was sound advice delivered neutrally, but to Kessler it was another humiliation, an inspector telling him how to fly his plane. "I'll take it under advisement," Kessler said through gritted teeth. Devlin closed his satchel. "Everything appears to be in order, from a documentation standpoint, Captain. For now." He paused, letting the final 2 words hang in the air. "I'll be flying with you today, in the cabin. My report will be filed upon landing in San Diego." He turned and left the cockpit without another glance, leaving the 2 pilots in a silence that was louder than a klaxon alarm. Kessler slumped into his seat, the leather groaning under his weight. He stared at the dizzying array of lights and switches, but he didn't see them. He saw only the calm, disappointed eyes of Devlin Anderson. Frank strapped himself into the right seat. He wanted to say something, anything, but what was there to say? "You really screwed up, Captain. That was the most unprofessional thing I've ever witnessed." He stayed silent, running through the pre-flight checklist with robotic precision. As the last of the passengers boarded, Kessler's fury began to bubble back up, displacing the shame. It wasn't his fault. The man was dressed like a civilian. He was being deliberately provocative. The airline's obsession with political correctness had gone too far. This was the FAA on a power trip. He, Roman Kessler, was the victim here. His grip tightened on the yoke. He would show him. He would fly the most perfect by-the-book flight of his life. He would land that 737 in San Diego so smoothly that the landing gear would kiss the tarmac like a lover. He would prove that he was an exemplary pilot, and this incident at the gate was a minor aberration, a misunderstanding provoked by an inspector with an attitude problem. The cabin door was closed, the jet bridge pulled away, and Flight 1128 pushed back from the gate precisely on time. Kessler's voice came over the PA system, a mask of jovial professionalism back in place. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome aboard Transcontinental Flight 1128, with service to San Diego. Captain Rick Kessler here, and it's my pleasure to have you with us. Flight time today will be just under 4 hours. We're expecting a smooth ride for the most part, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the friendly skies." Sitting in seat 12C, an aisle seat with a clear view of the cabin, Devlin Anderson heard the announcement. He didn't relax. He took a small government-issued notebook and a pen from his pocket. At the top of a fresh page, he wrote, "Flight 1128, ORD San. CPT R. Kessler, FOF Miller." Below that, he wrote, "Incident Gate K12, Refusal of Access 14, CFR 119.67, Unprofessional Conduct, Clear Profiling based on Race and Attire." Then he drew a line. The flight had just begun, and so had his real inspection. The paperwork was just the appetizer. The main course was observing how a man like Roman Kessler behaved when he was under pressure, wounded and angry. Devlin knew from long, bitter experience that prejudice at the gate was often just the tip of a very dangerous iceberg. The real test was about to happen at 35,000 feet. As the plane roared down the runway and lifted into the Chicago sky, Kessler felt a fleeting sense of control return. Up here he was king, but he was wrong. His kingdom was no longer his own. There was a federal agent in 12C, watching, listening, and writing. And over the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains, a storm system was brewing, moving faster than the captain knew, ready to test the limits of his pride. For the first 2 hours of the flight, a tense and artificial calm prevailed. Captain Kessler flew the aircraft with a rigid, almost mechanical precision. His every action was a pantomime of perfect procedure, a performance for an audience of one who wasn't even in the cockpit. He made his radio calls with crisp, clipped diction. He adjusted the heading by a single degree to follow the flight path with obsessive accuracy. In the right seat, Frank Miller felt like he was flying with a stranger. The usual cockpit banter was gone, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence, broken only by necessary communication. Frank tried once to lighten the mood. "Looks like the winds aloft are more favorable than forecast," he remarked, pointing at the ground speed indicator. "We might even get in a few minutes early." Kessler didn't look at him. He stared straight ahead at the endless blue horizon. "We will arrive at the time designated on the schedule, Miller. Not before, not after. Precision is the mark of a professional." Frank fell silent again. It was clear Kessler was in no mood for conversation. He was flying angry, and an angry pilot was an unpredictable one. Back in seat 12C, Devlin Anderson observed the rhythm of the cabin. He saw Susan Albright and her team perform their duties with flawless professionalism, but he also saw the tension in their shoulders, the forced quality of their smiles. They were walking on eggshells. He had noted Kessler's overly cheerful welcome announcement, a stark contrast to the venom he'd displayed at the gate. To Devlin, this wasn't a sign of recovery. It was a sign of duplicity. As they crossed from Nebraska into Colorado, the first shudders of turbulence rippled through the aircraft. It was light, the kind of air that seasoned travelers ignore, but it was a harbinger. On the flight deck, the weather radar painted a disturbing picture. The system that Devlin had warned about was indeed larger and more active than the initial forecast had suggested. A menacing blotch of yellow and red, indicating moderate to severe turbulence, lay directly on their planned southern deviation. "Center Transcon 1128, Frank said into his headset, requesting flight level 370 to top this weather ahead. A voice from the Denver Air Route Traffic Control Center crackled back. "Transcon 1128, unable flight level 370. At this time, traffic at your 12 o'clock opposite direction. Maintain flight level 350. I can give you a deviation further south if you like." Kessler keyed his mic before Frank could respond. "Negative center. We'll maintain 350 and ride it out. Transcon 1128. Frank turned to Kessler, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Captain, the radar is showing red cells on this track. That's a guaranteed miserable ride for the passengers, if not worse." "The radar is overly sensitive." Kessler snapped his knuckles white on the yoke. "It's a little chop, Miller, not a thunderstorm. Going further south will burn an extra 800 pounds of fuel and put us behind schedule. I'm not doing it. Sir, with respect, the FAA Inspector Anderson mentioned—" "I don't give a damn what the inspector mentioned." Kessler's voice was a low growl. "He's a desk jockey. I'm the one flying the plane. We are not altering our course based on a suggestion from a passenger. Is that understood?" This was it, the moment Frank had feared. This wasn't about weather or fuel anymore. This was about ego. Kessler was so determined to prove the inspector wrong that he was willing to fly his plane, his crew, and 150 passengers through a wall of violent air. It was a flagrant violation of the core tenet of aviation safety. A pilot's first and last duty is to avoid risk, not challenge it. "Captain, I strongly disagree with this course of action," Frank said, his voice firm, quoting the Crew Resource Management Manual verbatim. "This is an unnecessary safety risk." Kessler turned his head slowly, his cold eyes locking onto Frank's. "Your disagreement is noted, First Officer. It will be recorded in my flight report, as will your insubordination." The threat was clear. "Challenge me and I will ruin you." Frank felt a wave of cold fear, but it was quickly replaced by a surge of anger. He thought of the passengers, the flight attendants, the families on board. He thought of the quiet, authoritative man in 12C who was, at that very moment, trusting them to do their jobs. 10 minutes later, the plane hit the wall of turbulence. It wasn't a shudder. It was a blow. The 737 bucked violently, throwing the aircraft up and then dropping it sickeningly. A collective gasp went through the cabin. The fasten seatbelt sign chimed belatedly. Drinks sloshed, and a coffee pot in the rear galley crashed to the floor with a loud bang. Kessler's voice, now strained, came over the PA. Folks, just a little chop as we cross the mountains. Perfectly normal. We'll have the flight attendants remain seated for their safety." In 12C, Devlin Anderson gripped the armrests. His face was a mask of grim focus. This wasn't a little chop. This was at the very least severe turbulence, potentially extreme. He watched as the flight attendants strapped into their jump seats exchanged terrified looks. The plane dropped again, a stomach-lurching plunge that felt like a falling elevator. A scream echoed from the back of the cabin. Overhead, bins rattled violently. It felt less like flying and more like being inside a tin can being shaken by a giant. On the flight deck, alarms began to blare. A momentary overspeed warning as their airspeed fluctuated wildly in the violent updrafts and downdrafts. Kessler fought the controls, his knuckles, bone-white sweat beading on his forehead. The mask of the unflappable commander had been ripped away, revealing a man who was in over his head and knew it. "I have the aircraft!" He grunted, his teeth clenched. Frank, despite his fear, was working. His eyes scanned the instruments, calling out altitude deviations and airspeed changes. Altitude plus 200 feet. Airspeed decreasing. Now increasing. "Captain, we need to get out of this. Request an immediate heading change, any direction." For 5 terrifying minutes, they were caught in the storm's grip. Then, as abruptly as it began, they punched through to the other side. The air grew still. The violent shaking subsided, replaced by the steady, familiar drone of the engines. The silence in the cabin was profound, broken only by the sound of a crying child. Kessler, breathing heavily, finally keyed his mic to Denver Center. "Center Transcon 11 right. We experienced some more significant turbulence than forecast. Requesting a ride report for aircraft behind us." His voice was shaky. The controller's voice came back, laced with professional concern. "Roger that, Transcon 1128. We were about to call you. We've had you on a rapid altitude and speed fluctuation for the last 5 minutes. Are you declaring an emergency? Do you require assistance? Negative center." Kessler said, quickly, too quickly. "No emergency. We are fine. The aircraft is fine." Frank stared at him aghast. They had just been through a borderline uncontrollable event, an event that Kessler had deliberately flown into against his first officer's direct advice. Standard procedure demanded a full report, a potential diversion to check for structural damage. Declaring that everything was fine was not just wrong, it was a lie designed to cover his own catastrophic mistake. Devlin Anderson was already writing in his notebook. Deliberately entered area of forecasted severe turbulence against FO advice. Failed to secure cabin in a timely manner. Lost control of aircraft parameters. Failed to report severity of incident to ATC. He looked up from his notes as Susan Albright, her face pale, unbuckled herself and began to move through the cabin, checking on passengers. She stopped at his row. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm fine, Susan," Devlin said, quietly, using her first name. "How's your crew?" Her professional facade crumbled for a second. "Shaken. The new girl in the back. Jenny, I think she might have sprained her wrist when the pot fell. We need to check on everyone." "Was there any warning from the cockpit before that hit?" Devlin asked, his voice neutral. Susan shook her head. "No. Just the captain's PA after it started. We didn't even have time to secure the galleys properly." Devlin nodded slowly, his gaze intense. "Thank you, Susan. Please take care of your people and document any injuries meticulously." The rest of the flight to San Diego was conducted in a state of suspended animation. The air was smooth, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. But the atmosphere inside the aluminum tube was thick with recrimination and fear. Kessler didn't say another word to Frank that wasn't required by the checklist. Upon landing a firm, unremarkable landing that felt like a failure after Kessler's earlier boasts, he taxied to the gate. As the engine spooled down, he finally turned to his co-pilot. "Not a word of this to anyone, Miller." He hissed, his voice low and menacing. "It was turbulence. It happens. We handled it. Anyone asks, that's the story. Are we clear?" Frank Miller looked at the man he had once respected. He saw not a commander, but a petty, frightened bully trying to hide his own incompetence. "No, Captain," Frank said, his own voice, quiet but steady. "We are not clear at all." He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. "I will be filing a full ASRS report, and I will be speaking to Inspector Anderson." Kessler's face went purple with rage. "You'll be committing career suicide." "No," Frank said, turning to leave the cockpit. "I'll be doing my job." As the passengers deplaned, many of them casting angry or frightened glances toward the cockpit door, Devlin Anderson remained in his seat, waiting. He was the last one to leave. As he walked up the jet bridge, he saw Frank Miller and Susan Albright waiting for him, off to the side, away from the dispersing crowd. Their faces were anxious, but resolute. "Inspector," Frank began, "I need to talk to you." Devlin looked at Frank, then at Susan, and gave them a small, reassuring nod. "I know you do. Let's find a quiet place. We have a lot to discuss." He knew with a certainty that chilled him that this was no longer about a pilot's racist outburst at a gate. That was merely the loose thread he had pulled. Now the entire rotten tapestry of Captain Roman Kessler's career and the airline culture that enabled him was beginning to unravel. The debriefing didn't happen in a sterile airport conference room under the hum of fluorescent lights, where words are often measured and sanitized. Devlin Anderson knew that truth, especially the kind born of fear and intimidation, needed neutral ground to breathe. He led Frank Miller and Susan Albright to a quiet, anonymous coffee shop nestled inside a nearby hotel, a place of transient souls and conversations that evaporated as soon as they were spoken. The scent of roasted coffee and pastries hung in the air, a mundane and comforting backdrop for the extraordinary story that was about to unfold. They chose a booth in the corner, a small island of privacy. Frank's hands were wrapped around his mug, the ceramic warmth doing little to stop the tremor he couldn't control. Susan sat ramrod straight, her professionalism a thin armor over a deep well of exhaustion. She looked like a soldier who had been fighting a quiet war for years, and had just for the first time been given permission to describe the battlefield. Devlin didn't press. He simply waited his own cup of black coffee, untouched, his presence a calm and patient anchor. He created a space of safety, and into that space the truth began to flow. It started with Frank. He recounted the cockpit conversation not as a simple report, but as a visceral memory. He described the menacing glow of the weather radar, the condescending tone in Kessler's voice, the chilling finality of the words, "Your disagreement is noted, as will your insubordination." It wasn't a disagreement about the weather. Frank said, his voice raw with a mix of anger and disbelief. It was a fundamental rejection of safety. He looked at the data, he heard my warning, and he made a choice. He chose his pride. He chose to prove you wrong, Inspector. Frank looked at Devlin, his eyes pleading for understanding. He was willing to fly through a wall of red radar cells to risk everything just to win an imaginary argument with a man who wasn't even in the cockpit. The safety of 157 people was less important than his ego. He described the moment the turbulence hit the sickening lurch and the subsequent violent drop that felt like the sky had fallen out from under them. The alarms, the overspeed warning. It wasn't just chop, it was a loss of control. He was fighting the plane, not flying it. and all I could think was he chose this. This was a choice. Susan, emboldened by Frank's raw honesty, began to speak. Her voice was lower, wearier, but laced with steel. She painted a broader, more terrifying picture. This wasn't a single terrible decision. It was the culmination of a career built on fear. "We call his flights Kessler's Kingdom," she explained, the phrase tasting bitter. "The rules are whatever he decides they are that day. I've seen him humiliate flight attendants for serving coffee from the wrong side of the cart. I've seen him dress down gate agents until they were nearly in tears over a 10-minute delay that wasn't their fault. He creates this bubble of absolute power around the aircraft, and everyone inside it is just a subject." She then recounted the Honolulu incident, adding chilling details Frank hadn't known. The first officer on that flight, a kid named Paul, was green but good. By the book. He told Kessler twice, "We're not stable, Captain. We need to go around." Kessler just looked at him and said, "Are you going to land this plane, or do I have to do it by myself?" We broke through the clouds so low, I saw the roofs of the houses near the airport. It was a gut-wrenching, terrifying approach. Afterward, Paul looked like he'd seen a ghost. Kessler clapped him on the back on the jet bridge and said, "See, that's how a real pilot does it." He broke that kid's confidence and nearly broke the plane, and he called it a lesson. She leaned forward slightly. "Paul wanted to file a report. I told him he should. But we all knew what would happen. We'd all heard the whispers about Robert Chen." "Robert Chen?" Devlin asked, his pen pausing on the page. "A first officer, maybe 6-7 years ago," Susan said. "He filed a major safety complaint against Kessler. Something about an altitude bust near Denver, a near miss. 2 weeks later, Chen was gone. The official story was a fleet restructuring. But we all knew. It was a message. You cross Captain Kessler. You don't just lose an argument, you lose your career. Robert Chen became a ghost story we told new FOs to warn them." Devlin listened, his expression unchanging, but his mind was connecting the dots. The gate incident, the turbulence, the intimidation, the cover-ups. It was a perfect, horrifying storm. He wasn't just investigating a pilot. He was dissecting a pathology protected by a corporate culture of silence. After an hour, he finally closed his notebook. "Frank, Susan, what you've done today coming forward takes immense courage. I know the risks, but I promise you this will not be another ghost story. I will handle it from here. I need you both to file your own independent, detailed reports through the official channels, ASRS and the company portal. Be honest. Be thorough. I will personally ensure they are not buried." For the first time that day, a glimmer of hope appeared in Susan's eyes. Frank managed a small, grateful nod. They had lit the fuse. Now Devlin Anderson was going to carry the flame. His investigation moved with the quiet, relentless force of a glacier, carving through layers of corporate bureaucracy. His first act was to issue a series of federal subpoenas that landed on the desks at Transcontinental's headquarters like bombshells. He demanded Kessler's complete training records, his flight history, every performance review, and any and all crew complaints, anonymous or otherwise, filed against him for the entirety of his career. Simultaneously, he had a federal marshal secure Flight 1128's cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder before they could be routinely erased as part of their 24-hour cycle. The analysis of the black boxes took place in a soundproofed lab at an FAA facility. Devlin sat with a data technician in sterile silence as the flight data was rendered onto a screen. It was a chaotic symphony of red lines and sharp peaks. He saw the exact moment the plane entered the turbulence, a violent spike in G-forces, followed by a terrifyingly erratic line showing the altitude deviations. It was the dispassionate scientific proof of the terror Frank had described. Then came the CVR. The technician isolated the audio from the flight deck. In the quiet of the lab, Kessler's voice filled the air chillingly clear. "I don't give a damn what the inspector mentioned, he's a desk jockey." Devlin heard Frank's reasoned professional warnings, followed by Kessler's contemptuous dismissal. He heard the sudden cacophony of alarms, the grunts of exertion from Kessler as he fought the controls, the strained, shaky sound of his voice as he tried to reassure ATC that everything was fine. And finally, he heard the most damning line of all Kessler's voice, a low, menacing hiss on the ground in San Diego. "Not a word of this to anyone, Miller." It was a direct order to conceal a major safety incident, a clear-cut federal crime. Armed with this irrefutable proof, Devlin's team descended upon Transcontinental's internal reporting system. As Susan had predicted, it was a graveyard. But Devlin had the authority to resurrect the dead. He found the Honolulu report buried under a "resolved no action required" tag. He found 2 other complaints from intimidated first officers. And then deep in the archives, he found the ghost. The file on Robert Chen was thin, almost purposefully so. It contained the initial report detailing the altitude bust and near miss. Stapled to it was a terse 1-page summary from the chief pilot, a man named George Hammond, a known friend of Kessler's, concluding that the incident was due to first officer error. And finally a copy of Chen's resignation letter, dated 2 weeks later. It took Devlin and his team 2 days of digging through public records and old Pilot Association directories to find him. Robert Chen was running a small flight school in the sun-bleached landscape of rural Arizona, a world away from the gleaming corridors of a major airline. When Devlin reached him by phone, Chen was guarded, his voice thick with a suspicion that time had not erased. "I have nothing to say about Transcontinental or Captain Kessler," he said initially. "That was a long time ago." "Mr. Chen." Devlin said, his voice calm and steady. "I'm not with the airline. I'm with the FAA. I have your original report in front of me. I have the CVR from Kessler's most recent flight. I know you were telling the truth. I'm calling to offer you a chance to make sure your truth is finally heard." There was a long silence on the line. Devlin could hear the faint sound of a small propeller plane in the background. He could almost picture Chen staring out at the desert sky, a sky he should have been flying in a 737. Finally, Chen's voice came back heavy with the weight of 6 years of injustice. "What do you need me to do?" 2 weeks later, the summons arrived. The hearing room at the FAA's regional headquarters was designed to be intimidating. It was a space devoid of warmth, with grey walls, a polished mahogany table that seemed to stretch for a mile, and an air of sterile, bureaucratic power. On one side sat Captain Roman Kessler, looking diminished in a tailored suit that now seemed to hang on him. Beside him was his sharp-suited union representative, and 2 stone-faced executives from Transcontinental, including Chief Pilot George Hammond. They arranged themselves like a defensive line, their briefcases clicked open, ready for battle. On the other side sat Devlin Anderson. He was flanked by 2 FAA lawyers, but it was his calm, centered presence that dominated the room. He had no briefcase. He had a single thick binder in front of him. Devlin began, his voice dispassionate, laying the first brick of his case. "Let's begin at Gate K-12 Chicago O'Hare on the morning of October 12th. Captain Kessler, you refused a federal inspector, myself, access to your aircraft. You did so in a public and demeaning manner." The union rep jumped in his voice, smooth and practiced. "My client has already extended his apologies for that unfortunate misunderstanding. It was a high-stress environment, and Captain Kessler was acting out of an abundance of caution for security, as is his duty." Devlin didn't acknowledge the rep. His eyes remained fixed on Kessler. Was it also an abundance of caution that led you to consciously ignore NEXRAD weather data and a pilot report of severe turbulence and reject your first officer's direct and repeated safety recommendations? Before the rep could object again, Devlin nodded to a technician. The chilling sound of the CVR filled the room. I don't give a damn what the inspector mentioned. He's a desk jockey. I'm the one flying the plane. The sound of his own arrogant voice, stripped of context, and echoing in the dead silence of the room, made Kessler flinch as if struck. George Hammond's jaw tightened, the facade of corporate calm beginning to crack. Devlin continued methodically. He presented the flight data graphs, the wild, jagged lines, a silent testament to the violence the aircraft had endured. He read excerpts from Frank's and Susan's sworn statements, their words painting a vivid picture of a cockpit ruled by ego and a cabin gripped by fear. Then he moved to the pattern. The Honolulu incident, April of last year. Devlin stated, pushing a file across the table. An unstable approach, well below glide slope, against the explicit advice of the first officer. Hammond finally spoke, his voice a low rumble. Inspector, these are interpretations of events. Captain Kessler is one of our most decorated pilots. 30 years of service with an exemplary safety record. You're painting a picture based on the complaints of a few junior crew members who perhaps lack the captain's depth of experience. Devlin held Hammond's gaze. Is Robert Chen a junior crew member who lacks experience? The name fell into the room with the force of a physical blow. Hammond, the chief pilot, the corporate protector, froze. His carefully constructed composure shattered. That was a long time ago. I don't recall the specifics of that personnel matter. Then allow me to refresh your memory. Devlin said, his voice dropping to a cold, hard edge. He slid a final set of folders across the polished table. In this folder, you will find Mr. Chen's original report. You will also find your internal review, the one that concluded he was at fault. And on top you will find a new sworn and notarized affidavit from Mr. Chen detailing how you, Chief Pilot Hammond, personally threatened his career and coerced his resignation to protect Captain Kessler. Kessler stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. Hammond opened it, his face turning a pasty white as he read Chen's words. The Union rep read it, leaned back in his chair, and silently folded his hands. The fight was over. The kingdom had fallen, the ghost had returned, and he had brought receipts. Devlin Anderson stood up, his quiet authority, now filling every corner of the room. He looked directly at the broken man who had once been a captain. This hearing has revealed a pilot who is belligerent, reckless, and pathologically resistant to the fundamental principles of crew collaboration and aviation safety. You have demonstrated time and again that your ego is more important to you than the lives of your passengers and crew. He let the words sink in. Effective immediately pursuant to Title 49 of the United States Code, the Federal Aviation Administration is issuing an emergency revocation of Captain Roman Kessler's airline transport pilot certificate. Your license to fly is revoked. Your career is over. He then turned his steely gaze to the airline executives. Furthermore, Transcontinental Airways is hereby served with a notice of proposed civil penalty in the amount of $1.8 million for deliberately concealing safety violations and fostering a command culture that is fundamentally hazardous to public safety. You will also be subject to a mandatory FAA-supervised audit of your entire safety management system and a complete overhaul of your crew resource management training program. We will be in touch. Roman Kessler said nothing. He didn't protest. He didn't argue. He simply sat there, a hollowed-out man in an expensive suit. The 4 gold stripes on his uniform, which he had insisted on wearing now, looked like a costume from a play that had just ended in tragedy. He stood up on unsteady legs and without a word walked out of the room, not as a commander of the skies, but as a civilian stripped of everything that had defined him. The swagger was gone, replaced by the stooped shoulders of a man who had just flown his own life straight into the ground. In the end, this story isn't just about a pilot getting his comeuppance. It's a stark reminder that the biases we hold can be symptoms of much deeper, more dangerous flaws. Captain Kessler's prejudice was the public face of an ego that regularly risked hundreds of lives. The hero of this story isn't just Devlin Anderson, the quiet inspector who refused to be dismissed. It's also First Officer Frank Miller and Flight Attendant Susan Albright, who found the courage to speak truth to power, knowing it could cost them everything. Their integrity, combined with Devlin's authority, didn't just punish one man. It forced an entire airline to confront its toxic culture. It made the skies safer for everyone. If this story resonated with you, and if you believe that integrity and courage are the true engines of change, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and be sure to subscribe for more real-life stories where karma isn't just a concept, it's a destination. Thank you for listening.